We are pretty excited to get some time with best-selling author John Feinstein, who joins the show after 48 books, 23 New York Times bestsellers. What's it like to have the book The Ancient Eight come out this week for you?
Exciting as always. I mean, people always ask me what my favorite book is among the, actually, this is my 50th, believe it or not.
50. Oh, they got to update all the sites up there.
Yeah, I know. I sneaked
Do you
one
get
in.
any type of like a award for or watch for 50?
They'll probably give me a watch if I agree to go away. Uh, but
We don't want you to go
kind of
away.
thrilling. I never thought when I wrote my first book in 1986 that I'd end up writing 50. But it's always fun. I mean, that's the great thing is I have a job where I get paid to do things most people would pay to do. And this book, The Ancient Eight, is an example because I got to hang out with great kids from the Ivy League schools. I got to be on the sidelines and in the locker rooms, got to know the players and the coaches, and to find out more, which is what I wanted to do, about the whole Ivy League culture. So, 50th book, and I'm still as fired up as I was about my first. The only difference is that the guy I wrote my first one about hated me when it came out. These people seem to like me.
So we're in the ever evolving, literally day by day culture of college football, college basketball, college sports. What made you choose the Ivy League instead of, when people think of the Ivy League, they don't think that's sexy when it comes to
Right,
sports. They
exactly.
they think of the Big Ten, they think of the SEC, everything that's going on. So what made this the topic that you decided would be number 50?
What you just described is the ever changing world of college football, the realignments that go on, as you said, almost every day, the NILs, the transfer portal. I wrote a column for the Washington Post last year on a kid at VCU who was at his fourth school in 4 years. And by the way, great kid, great kid. There were reasons why he kept transferring, but in the old days, the rules wouldn't allow you to do that. The Ivy League is still about kids who go to college for 4 years. They almost never transfer. They don't get paid NILs. They're not in bidding wars for their services. They play 10 games in 10 weeks each season, and that's it. The season's over. The presidents, wrongly, in my opinion, don't allow the league champion to take part in postseason play the way all their other league champions do in the other sports, like basketball, for example. But you know what you're getting from the Ivy League. It's a throwback, Jeff. You feel like you're back in the 1960s, except with the modern amenities are still there. In the 60s, I don't think there were cell phones on the sideline.
Well, and you mentioned that talk about the role the Ivy League played in shaping the modern game. I mean, I joked with you before we started going to school at Rutgers. I saw the birthplace of college football where they played an Ivy League team. So talk
Yeah,
about how they really shaped the game that we see on the field today.
yeah. For the
Wait, wait,
record,
wait,
I was
wait.
not in.
First, I just first
Jeff
I
likes the
just want to say
Rutgers
how
drop.
impressed that Jason was that he slipped Rutgers into
Jeff
this
likes the Rutgers
conversation.
drop in the
go,
conversation. I could see his
go ahead,
smile
John.
there, John.
Good point, Bo. But Sonny Warblin went to Rutgers, so
There we
you
go.
have to respect that. Um, by the way, I was not there in 1869 for the Princeton Rutgers game.
That,
But the
that was
Princeton players still wear 1869 on their helmets, so the world knows they played in the first college football game. And most of the early great rivalries in the sport were, Princeton and Cornell, Yale and Harvard, Ivy League schools that were not yet the Ivy League, but they've been playing each other for more than 100 years. And back then, they were national champions. When I first walked into Harvard Stadium for a practice last year, I noticed there were 8 national championship banners on the scoreboard. The last one was in 1919 because the Ivy League presidents made a conscious decision in 1954 when they formed into the what I call the Ancient Eight because they're never going to change. They're never going to realign. They'll never add schools. They'll never lose schools. It'll be those same 8 schools forever. But when they formed in 1954 formally to compete against one another, they said, we don't want to compete for national championships. We want students who will graduate. We want not necessarily the best athletes, but the best students. We're not going to spend millions of dollars on recruiting and things like that. And they intentionally downgraded themselves to where they play today on the FCS level. And they're very good at the FCS level, by the way. Harvard last year played at Holy Cross Holy Cross was ranked 4th in the country. Harvard beat them. So if the presidents ever did allow the champion to play in the FCS tournament, I think the Ivy League would do very well. They'd be very competitive. But the presidents, to their credit, and I rarely give college presidents any credit, decided we want to have students who play football, not football players who occasionally are students. And there aren't in last year, Princeton's quarterback was the first transfer they had since 1988 when Jason Garrett transferred with his dad from Columbia to Princeton. And Penn had a player named Joey Slackman last year. Joey Slackman's like a movie. Grew up on Long Island, straight A's, all-state wrestler, all-state football player. Went to Penn as a wrestler. Was not recruited as a football player, but wanted to keep playing football. So he walked on the football team. He ended up last year being the Ivy League Defensive Player of the Year. And he's now playing at Florida as a grad student because he wanted to have an extra year of football before his career probably ended. Although who knows, with a kid like that, he might make it in the NFL, but he'll do more important things than play football. And I want to tell you one quick story about him. When Harvard and Penn were playing last year in its second overtime up in Boston, Cambridge, actually Boston, Harvard plays their games in Boston. He tore up his collarbone and came out of the game, and the doctors looked at it and said, you tore it, you're going to have surgery, you're done. And he understood that. They had one game left the next week that he wouldn't play in. But he went to the coaches during that second overtime and said, I'm going back in. I can't hurt myself any worse, and I don't care about the pain, but I'm going back in. He made a goal line tackle that had to be the most painful tackle anybody ever made to force the game into a third overtime. And he said, look, I knew my career was over, but I didn't want to go out standing on the sideline. I wanted to go out playing football. I love that kind of story.
And you know, with those athletes, the problem and the beauty of it is the same thing, that with regard to Ivy League athletes, they're not really expected to go on to the pros.
Right.
So they
Although
can
more do
continue
than you think. How many Ivy League players do you think are in the NFL right now?
right now.
Right now.
A dozen.
That's a great guess because
Yeah.
actually it's 12 to 16. Most guys guess 2 or 3. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No.
they aren't dependent on football for their lives or their living. But many of them are very good football players.
Right. But I think what comes out of that is because education's first, it's not, they don't pull themselves out of games because the draft is coming up for the most
No,
part.
they don't.
They have an education and they have a career goal set, which is the way the college athletes used to go, except for, you know, the top 50 in each sport.
Right.
But that's not the way it is now. And you have this struggle that the Ivy League is going to have to continue, I think, to deal with. And these student athletes not wanting to go to an Ivy League school, regardless of the cachet of the name of an Ivy League school, because they can go to another college and get NIL money now, let alone going to the pros.
Exactly. And there are many players, good players, who are good enough students to go to Ivy League schools who don't go to Ivy League schools because they can get paid going somewhere else. And because if it doesn't work out at their first school, they can go to a second school or a third school. Ivy League athletes aren't like that. They aren't going to get paid. And, excuse me. And in fact, because the Ivy League technically doesn't have athletic scholarships, they pay part of the way to go to school. Much of the time, they're not on full scholarships. So it is a different world. It is harder for the coaches to recruit to Ivy League schools. But what's interesting is they love the challenge. Many of them, Ray Priore's been at Penn now for 27 years. He loves the school. He loves coaching the kids at the school. Many of the coaches are graduates of Ivy League schools. There are 3 current grads of Ivy League schools. There were 4 last year before Buddy Tevens was mortally wounded in that bus accident back in March and then died right before the first home game for Dartmouth. Dartmouth was an unbelievable story for me to follow while I was researching this book because they lost their coach. They lost one of their players to cancer. and they were able to keep the team together, win their last 3 games, and tie for the Ivy League title. I wrote in the book that it's a Disney movie. I'm hoping I get a call from Disney.
Talk more about that. The culture around these schools and what they go through with the focus not just being on the field, but being as much off the field as it is on in a situation like Dartmouth when something like that happens.
Yeah, well, Sammy McCorkle took over the program. He had been an assistant coach for Buddy Stevens for 19 years. They had been assistants together under Steve Spurrier at Florida once upon a time. And he kept the team together. He and the other coaches, there were 8 coaches on the Dartmouth staff last year who'd been at Dartmouth for at least 9 years. Because I don't know if you guys have ever been up there. I had never been up there until I did this book. Once you go up there, you don't want to leave. I mean, it's just the other Ivy League people call Dartmouth a cult because people go up there. It's impossible to get there, and you get there, and then you never want to leave because it's so beautiful and it's such a great culture there among all the students, not just the athletes. And Sammy was able to keep the team together and keep the coaches together. And they kept saying their mantra last year was Buddy would have wanted this. Buddy would have wanted that. And they all knew they'd all been recruited by Buddy or hired by Buddy. They knew what he would have wanted from each of them, and they carried it through. And this year they're tied for first place again. And it's a remarkable story.
You talk in the book about rivalries. We're used to the traditional rivalries, the Michigan, Ohio State, the big school rivalries, but the
Right.
rivalries amongst the Ivy League are legendary, and there is something to them. What did you take away from talking to so many coaches, athletes, and people in the Ivies about those rivalries and how they've maintained themselves?
It's a really good question because, as you say, we tend to focus on Michigan, Ohio State, or USC, UCLA, whatever it might be, that great Big Ten rivalry, USC, UCLA. But
You're
because
talking to a Michigan man right there who can't get over the fact that they played at like Oregon and Washington.
I don't blame him. I feel the same way, for crying out loud.
He still doesn't think Rutgers should be in the Big Ten though, so it's
It
cool.
shouldn't be.
There you go.
Or
It
should
makes for a
Maryland.
fun
Best guess
television
ever.
commercial.
Or should Maryland, for crying out loud. But the intensity of the rivalries in the Ivy League, having been on the sidelines and in the locker rooms last year, is unique for a couple reasons. One, because they've gone on for so long. A lot of these players had their fathers play at the same school, or in some cases, even their grandfathers play at the same school and be part of the same rivalries. But you add in the fact that most of them will not play in the NFL. Most of them will go on to law school or medical school or Wall Street, hopefully not sports writing for their sake. But they know when they play those last 10 games in their senior year, it's only 10 games, no postseason, 10 weeks in a row, no buys, that their career's over. And they played football all their lives, just like the guys at Michigan and Ohio State, who do belong in the Big Ten, by the way. And so when you stand on the sidelines with those guys, they want to beat the team across the field so badly. You can literally feel it in your bones. And they want, because they know they're not getting extra chances. They know that the Ivy League title is the ultimate for them. And so when I'm at Yale Harvard last year with first place at stake along with Dartmouth, as I said, there was 50,000 people in the stadium, and you could almost feel it rock with emotion as the score went back and forth. It was a terrific football game. And I just feel that I was lucky to be exposed to all of these kids. I interviewed 82 players. And I can honestly say, guys, I didn't have one bad interview in the group. Not because I'm such a great interviewer, but because all the kids are so bright, so understanding of what I was trying to do, and so willing to share their stories. And I've said for a long time, dating back to when I did my Army Navy book in 1996, that you don't have to be rich and famous to have a great story to tell. You don't have to be Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, pick whomever is the best athlete in any sport. You don't even have to be Saquon Barkley in Philadelphia to have a great story. And I found that now in 3 different books I've done. Civil War, the Army Navy book, The Last Amateurs, my book on Patriot League basketball, and now this book on Ivy League athletes.
You've written about sports at all different levels, big
I
time
have.
college football programs, the pressure that those athletes are under. You talk to 82 athletes for this book, you talk to coaches, presidents. Talk about the pressure and the experience and how that's different for an Ivy League athlete who faces their own challenges balancing sports and academics that there
Right.
might not be at another school.
Right. Jalen Travis, who had a 3.71 GPA at Princeton and was an all league offensive tackle and is now at Iowa State as a grad student because Iowa State's near his home in Minneapolis and is being scouted by NFL scouts because he's that good. He's 6'7" and 315, not your typical size for an Ivy League athlete.
He's a
But
big Ivy League boy.
he's a big Ivy League, he's a big anything boy. But Jalen told me that, when you go to an Ivy League school, you make a conscious decision that you're going to have two full-time jobs because you want to be as good a football player as you possibly can be for those 4 years that you have at an Ivy League school. But you also know you're expected to graduate and you want to graduate. You want to have the option to go to graduate school if you want it. And as I said, he had a 3.71 GPA. And here's the best story about him, though. He grew up about 10 blocks in Minneapolis from where George Floyd was murdered. And he was a high school junior when it happened, or between junior and senior years. And he and one of his friends, another high school kid, formed a foundation. Two 18-year-old kids formed a foundation to raise money so inner city kids in Minneapolis could get enough funding to get the education they needed to go to college. And they pulled it off. Now, these are high school kids and they did this and they wanted to do something to contribute. And Jalen Travis was also 2 years ago the New Jersey Truman Scholarship winner, which goes one kid, not one athlete, one kid, one college student from each state gets one of those scholarships. An extraordinary young man and a good football player.
How much pressure is there, or do you perceive there to be, with regard to these kids now coming in to stay in an Ivy League school? Is the mentality when they get there, hey, I know what the deal is, or does the pressure continue once they get there that they're going to have money thrown at them if they're good enough to go to a non Ivy League school?
The pressure will be there to have that money thrown at them because they can transfer anytime they want with the transfer portal like everybody else. But I there were 5 transfers in the Ivy League last year total in the 8 schools, and there were 5 transfers out. So you're right that they make a conscious decision. I'm picking a college that is a college and a coach that is going to encourage me to get better and to stay. I'm not just picking a place where if things don't go right in the first year, I transfer. And if I have the chance to get a lot of NIL money, I'm going to grab it. They understand that if they have an Ivy League degree, they'll probably make a lot more money long term than they might make short term with the NILs.
It's interesting because this book covers a ton of historical ground while telling the story through the eyes of the current athletes in the league. How did you approach balancing the historical narrative of Ivy League football with the modern day issues and challenges that the league faces today?
Well, I made a conscious decision that there have been books written about the history of the Ivy League and stories about what went on in the 1920s between Harvard and Yale, things like that. They stopped playing for 2 years, by the way, in the late 1800s because the games had gotten so violent. And it wasn't until President Theodore Roosevelt, an Ivy League graduate, stepped in and said, we've got to find ways so that people aren't getting hurt so much. And the forward pass. There was no forward pass when college football started. It was more like rugby than like the game we see today. And so I made the conscious decision I wanted to focus on today's players. That's why it says today's Ivy League in the subtitle, because I felt like the book had been done to at least to some degree on the history of the league, which is great. But I wanted to do a book that was fresh, where you learn new things about how the league has changed and who the players are and who the coaches are and why the kids make the decision to go to Ivy League schools and what football means to them, even in today's era where there's so much focus on the FBS schools who play for the national championship.
You mentioned how it was like rugby. You discuss in the book how the Ivy League helped shape the game's evolution in terms of strategy and rules. Can you talk about some of those key innovations that people have no idea came out of the Ivy League?
Well, the forward pass is certainly one of them.
Well, that's one.
Yeah, that's a pretty important one. And as I said, President Roosevelt, who was an Ivy League graduate, stepping in while president and saying, "Look, I love this game. I don't want it to go away, but at the rate we're going, it will go away." And so the rules that he came up with to keep people from killing each other were very important in the evolution of the game, not only in the Ivy League but everywhere else. And I think the idea that, going back again before 1954, that you could go to a great academic school and still play good football was an important part in the game's evolution. The University of Chicago, great academic school, was a power once upon a time. Jay Berwanger won the Heisman Trophy out of there, but the school decided, we don't want this. It's too violent. It's too expensive. You have to sell your soul to be a national contender, and they shut the program down completely. The Ivy League found a middle ground. They cut back on how much they were spending on recruiting, how much they were spending on facilities, although they have been able to raise a lot of money for facilities in the last dozen years or so. And they kept playing very competitive football. When the University of Chicago finally started playing football again, it was on the Division III level. Nothing wrong with that, just different from what the Ivies decided to do.
You've written this book. You mentioned the Army Navy book. The books that you write, you say that I don't know how to put this, but tradition seems to be important in the books that you write.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at. Is how important is when you're telling these stories to talk about the tradition? Because Jason and I have covered the Army Navy game. We've gone to Ivy League games before. They may not have 110,000 people in the stands, but
Right.
there is something about, and it's not the game. It's everything around the game that seems so
Right.
important.
The
Right.
game on the field is secondary to everything else that goes around it.
Yeah. Well, again, you mentioned Army Navy, and of course, I've been to a lot of Army Navy games, and it's the one game all year where when they play the national anthem, I get chills because you see 8,000 hands snap to salute position, and it's cool. What happens before the game, like you just said, is in some ways as important as what happens in the game. Not to the players, by the way,
Right.
but to the rest of us. And I love the notion in doing the Ivy League book. I love the notion that Eddie Marinaro was playing at Cornell, and his father Ed finished second in the Heisman Trophy race in 1971. Probably should have won. He was an extraordinary running back at Cornell and had a terrific career with the Minnesota Vikings, and then, of course, went on to his acting career. So I love the idea when I'm at Yale that I'm in the same place uh, where Brian Dowling and Calvin Hill played in that famous Harvard Yale game in 1968 when Harvard scored 16 points in the last 42 seconds, and the Harvard Crimson wrote what I think is still the greatest sports headline ever: Harvard beats Yale 29-29. So when I think about those moments, as you said, Jeff, as I'm standing on a sideline or I'm in a locker room, I'm one of those guys who gets chills from tradition, and I got a lot of chills last year doing this book.
Is there a, we're watching, it may be a 1 year deal, but we're watching this resurgence of Army and Navy right now. Army undefeated at this point. Is there a correlation that can be made between what's going on in Army and Navy and their ability to be competitive with what could go on in the Ivy League going forward?
I don't know. Is the honest answer? I mean, I love the fact that Army is 9-0 and that Navy is 7-2, and that they might play in the AAC championship game. Might play each other twice in 8 days. I don't know. That's a good idea, but it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I don't like that at all.
Yeah, I don't think the players will probably love it. I'm not sure anybody else will,
Right.
but if it happens, Navy's going to have to beat Tulane on Saturday to have any chance to play in the championship game. Army's in pretty good position to play in it, but my son years ago after I wrote the book said to me, he was 7, I think, "Dad, who do we root for when Army plays Navy?" And my answer was, whomever's losing. And I feel pretty much that same way about the Ivy League schools. Although obviously the Dartmouth story last year was so extraordinary. You had to root for it to happen, and for those kids and for Sammy McCorkle and his coaches. It was just an amazing story that they were able to pull that off.
Are there broader lessons for the world of college athletics as a whole that can be taken from the Ivies?
Yes, but I don't think most of the college world wants to take it. They just want to win games and sell out big stadiums, play on national TV, have the TV announcers talk about how every kid is a great kid, which I laugh when I hear because I knew some of those kids when I covered big time college football. But the lessons are there that you can be very competitive and you can still have students. I hate the term student athletes because it's just an NCAA ruse to try to follow, fool us into thinking all these kids are. Have you ever seen? I'm sure you've seen the NCAA commercial where the kid is a swimmer and he dives into the pool and he swims and he gets out of the pool and he plays the cello.
Yeah.
I always laugh at that one.
They brought their cello to the pool to play
To the
that.
pool, yes, yes.
It's not good for the wood, by the way, but go ahead.
You know what's interesting? So my dad, 100 years ago, used to stop and play touch football after school, and then go to his violin lesson.
See, he could have played in the.
He might have been the inspiration.
Might have been the inspirations. I never learned to play the violin. I did play a lot of touch football, but yes, the answer is yes. Of course, they could be an example, but nobody wants to follow that example, and that's why the kids who play in the Ivy League are so extraordinary that they make a conscious choice to follow this road, and knowing that it will be harder, as Travis Jalen says, you got two full-time jobs, and you have to work very hard at both of them. And that's what they do. They work very hard at both of them. Almost all of them stay 4 years. Almost all of them graduate. And almost all of them go on to do stuff that none of the three of us will ever do.
John, as a writer, it's never about you. You're writing these stories about people, and you're never part of the story, except you can feel it when you're writing, the passion that you have behind it. One of the things that we do when we have athletes and coaches on the show is talk about how they use their platform. You're no different. We've seen that you've raised over $5 million for ALS research. What made you decide that you wanted to use the platform you had for that?
I'm sorry, Jeff. Just the opportunity. I felt like if I could. Bruce Edwards was a good friend of mine. He was Tom Watson's caddy for 30 years. He died of ALS at the age of 49. And I actually wrote a book about Bruce and Tom while Bruce was dying. That's the most pressure I ever felt writing a book because I wanted to get it done before Bruce died. And I made it by a week. And when it was over, it affected me very deeply. And I learned while researching that book that ALS is as awful a disease as there is because your mind is still intact and you literally sit there and watch your body fall apart until you die. And everybody who gets ALS dies, usually in 3 to 5 years. Some last longer, but they're exceptions, not the rule. And I wanted to do something about ALS, try to help a little bit. I also was very involved with a basketball tournament in Washington called the BB&T Classic that Maryland and George Washington hosted, and we raised a lot of money there and it made me feel good. And there were a couple times, especially with the golf tournament, which I was in charge of, where I got frustrated because guys would say they were coming to play and then would back out. And my wife, God bless her, kept saying, "You got to keep doing this." I didn't get paid, obviously. You got to keep doing this because this is more important than anything you'll ever write. And I thought she was right, so I kept at it.
The book, obviously, we could talk to you all day long. Good on you for using the platform that you have to make a difference outside of the impact you make on the books you write. The book here that everybody should pick up is The Ancient Eight. Learn about the history of the Ivy League, the present of the Ivy League, and the future of the Ivy League. John Feinstein, thank you so much for giving us the time. We hope to get to talk to you again one day.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Thanks a million.